Welcome to Running Your Stories. I'm here with Richard Staite.
Hello.
And I've been looking forward to this conversation after having met your partner Anna Troop on the Lakeland 100.
Yeah.
And during our approximately 20 hours of running together, I got told a few stories about your good self.
Right.
And so I've been looking forward to coming along and meeting you properly and hearing a bit more about your journey through a variety of sports.
I hope they were good stories.
I believe so, yes. So where would you like to start, Richard? Am I going to have to drag things out of you, or are you going to come voluntarily?
Well, there's been quite a few sports over the years. One sort of evolves into another.
Yes.
They're all endurance-based sports, I guess. That's the common theme amongst everything I've ever done, starting with rowing, I guess. I haven't been a great team sport player, I guess, but I always like the endurance sport community, particularly the people you kind of meet and associate with in those sports just seem to be kind of my kind of people, I suppose, the people I like. So that's been a natural place to sort of go with the sports I've been doing. So I guess, started with a lot of rowing from the age of about 11 onwards, encouraged by my older brother, who was 6 years older. By the time I was 13, 14, training, pretty much every day. And, sometimes twice a day by the time I'm sort of 15, 16. And, once you start getting into competing, I suppose you find that if you compete and you lose, you kind of go back to the drawing board and think, right, I'm going to train harder. And you go back again, and if you lose, you train harder, and eventually you win, and then you love the fact you've won, and to some extent there's a sort of the attention you get if you win. And I think once you can get into that kind of environment, you as a 16, 17-year-old, when you've got other pressures on you for doing O-levels, A-levels or whatever, it just gives you that motivation to sort of focus on one thing and try to do it as well as you can. And for me, starting with the rowing, but moving on to running or triathlons or ultra running or climbing, it's a need to sort of focus on one thing if you're going to do it very well at any one time. I think you can move from sport to sport over a few years, but if you're going to be hopefully at the top of your game in one sport, you're going to have to do that pretty much exclusively.
So you mentioned that top of the game. What level were you at with the rowing?
Well, so I guess by the time I was 16, I'd won the national championships in the single sculling event. I had to single scull more than doing larger boats like 4s or 8s, because it's one of those inevitable things. I was at a local rowing club in Evesham, and you find that if you want to sort of be a bit more serious than maybe the other people around you, you're inevitably going to have to end up in a single scull. Yeah. There weren't enough other sort of people who wanted to train sufficiently hard, I suppose, to be competing in a 4 or an 8. So it was single sculling. So that was about 16. I also competed at Henley Royal Regatta that same year and won one of the opening sort of rounds, which was I suppose unusual for a 16-year-old to win at that point, especially because I was so small for a rower at that point, only weighing 10 stone 2 and racing adults weighing quite a lot more. Then the next year, moving on into the junior national team and competing in the double sculls at the Junior World Championships for Great Britain. The year after that, I actually took a year off rowing seriously because I was doing my A-levels and wanted to get the best grades possible, primarily because by that point I decided I was very keen on rowing in the boat race. So obviously to get to Cambridge or Oxford I needed the good grades, so I really focused on getting those grades. And then the year after that I went to the under 23 World Champs in the British team, and then I went to Cambridge, spent 4 years at Cambridge rowing in the boat race, and also competing again at the under 23 world champs and at the senior world champs when I was about 21, I guess. So a lot of very serious rowing at that point, trying to be as good as possible. Always a bit of a challenge because I'm not naturally the size of a normal rower. I only naturally weigh around just over 11 stone, and you're competing against people who are often, 14, 15, 16 stone. So all the time you're really having to concentrate on, those marginal gains, everything you can possibly do to get yourself up to the top of your game, as I said. Because I just didn't have the sort of physical strength to sort of just naturally compete.
Yeah, it sounds like it takes a lot of focus. And you mentioned about, finding people of a similar type in the sport. Yet you also mentioned having to do single scull because you're working harder than the other people around you. So it sounds like one of life's kind of usual sort of contradictions.
No, that's right. I mean, it's a debate we have in our family as to whether you really focus on one thing and you try to be as good as you possibly can, or do you do a lot of different things quite well and just enjoy them all? Because if you do focus on one thing, obviously there's going to be times when it's going to be pretty tough, and all that sort of hard training you do is quite tough. But ultimately, you hopefully achieve something at the end of it, which you then remember for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
As opposed to doing lots of different things moderately well, but they all sort of blur into the background. And I just made that choice to really focus, and that's a good word to use, because I think it requires real sort of focus. And I think as much as anything, it's around having a clear goal or goal setting. It's one of those things which psychologists often talk about.
Yes.
And once you have a very clear goal, it becomes much easier to sort of do your training, as it were, because you know why you're getting up at 6 in the morning, and you actually want to get up at 6 and train, or whenever it is, or if you get home after school or after work and it's dark and you don't really want to go training, you only have to remember you have that goal in front of you, and suddenly things become that much easier. So I'm a big sort of fan of goal setting, if you want to actually achieve something very specific.
So you got up to sort of under 23 world champs, run for Cambridge,
and also the senior world champs team as well.
Yeah.
For 1 year I went to the world championships at the senior level. After university, this is again one of the challenges for a lot of people who do sport when they're young, is how long you can maintain that kind of intensity. And at what point you really want to have a break from it.
Yes.
And if you start too young, there is that danger that you sort of almost burn out, for swimmers, you often see it in their sort of late teens. For rowers, it could be a little bit later. For me, after 4 years of rowing intensity at Cambridge and in the national team at the same time as well, I then just decided to step back and have a break from that. I actually left university and went straight off to live in Hong Kong for 6.5 years. And it's a very, deliberate choice to sort of step back from, top level competition. Because I did see a lot of the people I rowed with who continued on into their 20s, and were so focused on trying to win a medal at the World Championships, or a gold medal at the World Champs, or a gold medal at the Olympics, and it consumes your entire life basically. And if you don't achieve that, you sort of go back year after year after year, and you get to your early 30s and all you've done is that sport, and I think that's great, but then you do have that dilemma of the fact that you've not been maybe you've missed out on other things. You haven't sort of developed a career by that point, and you really have to make a decision as to what kind of life you want, really. And I just decided that I needed a change at that point, having done it very intensely and achieved most of what I wanted to achieve. Because for me, it's what's more interesting about a lot of sports is almost more the process and the learning process you go through. And with rowing, I never won a medal at the World Champs, but I've sort of been through that entire process of leading up to it and all the training you do to it. I could carry on for many other years, maybe getting marginally better, but the sort of process wouldn't really change. It would just be a question of, doing a little bit more each year. So by that point, I'd sort of felt I'd sort of done my rowing stuff, and it was time to sort of move on to doing other things.
So you're then out in Hong Kong, and did you pick up another sport when you were out there?
Well, to some extent. I mean, that's a difficult environment to do a lot of sport in, partly because it's so hot and humid. I carried on rowing semi-seriously. Well, not seriously, but some rowing. I also did start to do a little bit of sort of early trail running out there. There's something called the Maclehose Trail, which was a charity event organised by the Gurkhas out in Hong Kong. This was at a time when Hong Kong was still run by the British, and the Gurkhas were stationed there, and they put on this charity race, and it was I think it was 100 kilometres, a lot of ascent, descent, and that was my first experience of trail running. But in a very hot and humid environment, which made it quite tough. So there was only a limited amount that you could do of that. But sport definitely took a step back. I'd say I was trying to develop a career at that point, and so I wasn't full-time focused on that.
Okay, so I know you mentioned to me earlier you were in Hong Kong for about 6 years, and then back to the UK, was it, or somewhere else?
Then back to the UK, and then back to a mixture of sports, I suppose. A little bit of rowing, some marathon running, and then fairly soon starting to do more climbing, and that was the sort of start of my mountaineering career, as it were. And again, it was that sort of process of coming into contact with some people friends who did mountaineering and climbing and sport climbing, and going off and climbing easier mountains like Mont Blanc or whatever, or also just going into indoor climbing walls, and really enjoyed that challenge and the sort of learning process. And you start chatting to people, and you may well find it inspiring what they've done, and I find it quite easy to start investigating the places they've been to, and reading books, watching films, and I find that whole world of being outdoors on the top of a mountain, when it's dark and wet and wild or whatever, just a great place to be, really. It was then that I really started to go off on training courses up in Scotland or Wales or whatever, learning how to climb and everything about it, and off in the Alps, and developing more friends in that world. And so sort of one thing leads to another, and as you sort of think about harder climbs or higher climbs, and then starting to go to more remote places, and then you sort of start going higher and higher and seeing how you can deal with altitude, and that in itself is a whole sort of interesting question mark physiologically, how you deal with altitude.
I tend not to deal with it very well.
Well, I think it's fascinating how different people respond so so differently to it. And even on relatively low mountains like Mont Blanc or Kilimanjaro, you can be wandering up there and be fine, and the person you're with next to you could be, being sick quite regularly and feeling awful. And so, again, it's one of those things where you sort of prepare yourself and you focus and you read about, what can you possibly do to sort of counteract the effects of altitude sickness, which ultimately is the real issue on very high mountains. And it's the altitude which is a real challenge. And whether that's making sure you're always very well hydrated, or the speed at which you ascend, trying to actually listen to your body. And what people often say is actually the fittest people suffer the most, only because they often go up too quickly and they're just finding it quite easy to sort of walk up this high mountain, and then suddenly a few hours later they'll just be hit by terrible altitude sickness because they've gone too quickly, and you won't know it at the time, but it'll hit you later on. So going incredibly slowly and that kind of thing. So those are all the sort of interesting angles that you come across when you're at high altitudes and how you're going to deal with them. Again, it's the sort of process, the learning process, which I find quite interesting. I suppose I have a sort of natural interest in physiology, and always happy to sort of investigate those kind of things.
So I understand that you kept going higher and higher till you couldn't get any higher.
So in 2005 I climbed up Everest, and that had been something that had been building up over a few years. I'd had a couple of friends who'd attempted to climb Everest and had to turn back because of bad weather. And, the stories that they sort of come back with, again, it's one of those things where you talk to people about it and you start to think, I quite like to go and see where they were. Or you can obviously read lots of books about these places or see stuff on films. And Everest is one of those things which draws you in. I think the population is divided between people who sort of find themselves quite fascinated by it and drawn in by it, or those who just said, I never want to ever do that. But if you are one of those people that sort of finds it interesting, then it's fairly easy to start thinking, I'd quite like to go and do that. Actually doing it is obviously, a challenge, because, most people are working, so suddenly taking 2 or 3 months off simply to go and climb up a mountain is not so easy to organise. It's not that cheap, obviously. And just actually, saying, right, I'm going to do it, and getting on and doing it is quite hard. But basically, I got to the end of 2004 and was thinking about what I was going to do in the next year, and I couldn't see a reason why I shouldn't do it. So I organised that, and 2005 headed off at the end of March, and was away all through April, June. We didn't actually climb to the summit until about July 6th, which is really very late in the season, because we'd had bad weather. We were waiting to get to the summit, and then coming back on sort of 9th, 10th July, having been away for a good 2.5 months, away from work, which that my employers were quite understanding at the time, which was helpful.
Helpful, yes.
And then back to real life. But you've got to be prepared to sort of take a lot of time off work and camp up a mountain. I think we were camped up there for 65 nights in total, at quite high altitude, which is probably the hardest bit of the whole thing. Is a lot of the time you're feeling quite nauseous because you're at high altitude. A lot of people can't eat or sleep properly. It feels a bit like you've got a permanent hangover. And at some points there's, an element of boredom which sets in, because you're camped at base camp or advanced base camp, and, waiting day after day for something to happen, for the weather to change. We had Ranulph Fiennes camped alongside us when I was there, and we could go and talk to him about his expeditions across the Arctic or Antarctic, and he would say he found Everest just mentally actually harder, just because of the sort of almost the boredom element, at least when he was doing his Arctic stuff, Antarctic stuff. He was out there every day, plodding on, whereas on Everest he was just sitting there waiting something to happen, which psychologically is quite tricky, because as you wait to get to the summit, you often start feeling gradually worse and worse physically, because your muscles do actually waste away fairly rapidly at high altitude. People lose weight, they can't eat, they start to feel ill, and they start losing confidence. They think, I'm never going to make it. And you do those climatization climbs while you're there. And if you're struggling, and there are other people with you who are doing better, and you're the one who's sort of feeling worse, you're going to really start to worry about, am I ever going to make it? And you saw quite a lot of that amongst the teams there, different people responding differently to that kind of stress and pressure, and everybody's there, and behind every one of those people, they've got a mass of people who are sort of supporting them or know they're there, and so there's this sort of extra pressure, I suppose, of knowing everyone knows you're there to climb Everest, and you don't want to let them down or whatever. So there is, and it's, for most people, it's a once in a lifetime sort of opportunity to do it. You don't want to come back the next year. So the psychology of the people there was quite interesting. Even at base camp, people were almost sort of dropping out because they just decided they couldn't make it. They were feeling too bad, even at base camp. Branwell Fines actually had to, I seem to remember he was on oxygen for some of his time at the base camp, because he wasn't acclimatizing that well, I don't think.
So, I mean, as I mentioned, I've done a bit of climbing in my time, a few things in the Alps and things, and it is always, as you say, like a dream of anyone that's climbed any mountain, that one day you might get onto Everest. So what was it actually like when you pushed to the summit? I mean,
so as I said, we were there longer than expected. So I climbed from the north side, and that was very specifically because it's the less crowded side. Everybody knows that Everest is now quite crowded. Some of the pictures from this year are quite incredible of the queues up the mountain. It does seem to have got significantly worse since I climbed in 2005. But even back then, obviously, there were more and more people doing it. On the north side at that point, and I think still probably now, about a quarter of the number of people climbed from the north side. So that was the reason. I didn't want to have that risk of having a queue or anything similar that could cause you a risk or a problem. So on the north side, you don't have the Hillary step, which is the sort of real bottleneck. Although there is something a little bit similar, it's not quite as bad, and there's less people. And you don't have to go through the Khumbu ice floor as well, which is another huge sort of risk that you can't control. You don't have that on the north side. North side is in some ways slightly more technical. There's some steeper sections, a bit rockier almost, because in many places the snow is just being blasted off the mountain. So a lot of the time on your crampons, you're scrabbling almost over rock more than snow and ice. But quite mixed terrain when you're climbing up there. And as I said, we got delayed by the fact that there's very high wind for 3 weeks longer than there really should be, because on Everest the idea is you go, you acclimatise, and you wait for the wind speed to drop down. You have this window, often in May, when the wind is sort of manageable, as it were, because normally it'd be blasted by 200 mile an hour winds or whatever. But the wind speeds were just very high for longer, and so we went up to the summit on the first day that those winds had dropped down, but on the way up to the summit the winds were still incredibly strong. So that's almost my biggest memory of those. It was 4 days from advanced base camp up to the summit. and just being blasted by these incredibly high winds. Now, from a technical perspective, climbing up there is going to be relatively easier than probably the climbing you've done or that I've done in the Alps or whatever. But it's just that you're doing it at altitude, which is a real challenge.
Yes.
So one hard move, one clamber up onto a boulder or whatever, leaves you kind of exhausted and you can't move for a while while you out of breath. That was what it was like for the first sort of 3 days climbing from base camp up, just being blasted by these high winds. The tents we were using were sort of being sort of blown apart, that kind of thing. And when you're already unable to breathe and then you'll suddenly have the sort of wind speed going past you at 60 miles an hour, it's like sticking your head out of a car window. It feels even harder to breathe. So I think, again, psychologically, sort of seeing people actually having real panic attacks, because yes, we were at the higher altitudes wearing oxygen, but even with an oxygen mask on, you can find that it just feels like you're suffocating, which is quite a bizarre and frightening thing to happen. And one or two people would sort of turn round just because they were so stressed by that. You get up to your sort of third camp on the way up there, and then you arrive there at sort of 10, 11 in the morning and lie in a tent for a few hours, and then we set off for the summit at 11 p.m. that evening. And I mean, the climb up to the summit, I found, became sort of exponentially harder. That top camp was 8,300 meters, but every 100 meters you went beyond that, it sort of got like twice as hard. And then by the last 100 meters, it became incredibly hard just to sort of, it really was one step in front of another and sort of can barely move. And as you got those last 100 meters, it felt like you're never ever going to make it. Even though the summit's literally just over there, you'll barely move. And all sorts of other things can start happening. For me, my eyesight was starting to blur over. And so you start to obviously worry that you're moving into a position where you're not actually going to be able to get back out of it again in any easy way. And it's quite hard to know how much to keep pushing on when you're feeling that bad. But we had moved reasonably quickly and we were on schedule, and we made it to the summit about 8 a.m. A lot of people struggle and go a lot slower, and the problem is, if you don't make it to the summit until much later in the day, then you're faced with turning around and potentially descending in the dark when you're exhausted, and that's when all the problems start to happen. So the fact that we'd moved reasonably quickly up there gave me enough sort of confidence not to worry too much. But yeah, even with an oxygen cylinder on, you do have this sensation of kind of suffocating. And I suppose even standing on the summit, feeling that bad and with vision that's blurring over, it's quite hard to really enjoy standing on the summit for too long, because you're sort of quite worried about what's happening and getting down again. So it was great to be there, and it was, once we were up there, it was a sort of beautiful view, and you really can see the earth kind of curving away from you on all sides.
You mean to say it's not flat?
Definitely not flat. Somehow you can work out that it's curving away. And cloud levels, miles and miles below you. So that was spectacular, and you can see the other 8,000 meter peaks sticking up out of the clouds and what have you. But that sort of sense of elation, the real emotion, definitely didn't hit me till actually I'd got right back to Kathmandu, back to sort of safety and a lot more oxygen back at that level, before I felt fantastic. But standing on the summit itself was just right. We've got here, take a couple of photos, or try to take a couple of photos, look around, and then let's get out of here again. It was kind of, the feeling that you kind of had up there. And yeah, descending can be quite an interesting challenge as well, because you just want to get out of there as quickly as possible. And coming down, as you will know from climbing, coming down is often more difficult than going up. And you don't always, because you've got to descend quite a long distance, and on the North Ridge it's effectively a series of sort of drops, and then a flatter bit and a drop and then a flatter bit. Those steep drops, what's called the second step, which is where Mallory and Irving were supposed to have disappeared in 1924, I think, is a sort of 50-foot pretty steep drop, and it's a flat rock surface, and in fact there is a ladder strapped to that bit of rock put there by the Chinese, I think in 1975 or something, and barely anybody has ever climbed up it or down it without that ladder being in place, because it's so smooth. But getting over the lip of that drop onto that ladder can be quite tricky. That's one point where I was scrabbling around, almost about to sort of fall off there, getting a boot wrapped around in an old rope or a crampon caught in an old root, and again you're sort of running out of oxygen, half over the edge of this 50-foot drop, and sort of hands scrabbling to sort of hold on to something, and you have those sorts of moments. And I should probably have taken a lot more time and care to get over that bit, which was clearly the almost like the most dangerous point on the whole climb, but somehow just sort of went over without being attached. I should have, spent a bit more time to sort of think about it, but you just sort of over went, and that was it. Suddenly you're almost in a sort of real life-threatening situation.
Yeah.
Apart from that, I think everything was fine. But yeah, I mean, one slip there, and that could have been it. But
yeah, you must handle the pressure of those kinds of situations pretty well then. Do you manage to stay calm? And
generally, yes. Well, I think Anna would say that I think when we're out running on the mountains or whatever, high in the mountains, doing something, and if something stressful happens, one of us slips, I think she gets quite a surge of adrenaline or cortisol, which can be quite stressful. I don't tend to get the same sort of response.
Yeah.
I think I don't tend to worry quite as much, but it just doesn't have the same effect. But I think a lot of those situations, the best thing is to have thought about them in advance and prepared for them in advance, and always know, what would I do if this happens or that happens? And I suppose climbing Everest was the perfect example of where you need to or can prepare if you want to. You can talk to an awful lot of people who've tried to climb it or climbed it, and get their advice and know in advance what the possible problems could be. And once you've been through all that, you should have everything covered. As I said, there's just the odd thing that will always sort of go wrong.
Yeah. So this, you mentioned earlier about really liking the process and the learning of sport and different disciplines. Where do you think that sort of drive comes from to like that and want to follow the process? Because it sounds like you were doing it from possibly as young as 11 years old. Is that where you think it came from, being in a structured sport from such a young age? Or
well, that's a question I've never really thought about, but I think you're right. I think it was just something that naturally came to me when I started rowing when I was quite young. I took an immediate interest, I suppose, in the sort of sports science, as it were. I've still got some books, even from when I was 14, 15, on sports nutrition and sports psychology and all of that kind of thing. And I actually found them the other day, and they are still relevant today. Things have not changed that dramatically, certainly on the psychology side of things. And to be honest, nutrition hasn't really changed a lot. There's been a huge amount of debate over the years about nutrition and this diet, that diet, but ultimately, it's still much of the same things as were relevant back then. So I don't honestly know where it comes from. I have a sort of natural, maybe leaning towards being more of a scientist than anything else. So the sort of scientific side of preparing your body is something that interests me. I think from quite a young age, because I don't consider myself to be a sort of natural sports person, particularly in the rowing world, I'm not big enough, but I don't think I'm a natural runner either. So again, you're always looking to sort of those marginal gains and how else can you improve? And it's just a sort of a mental process you go through, which I think you kind of can apply to all kinds of parts of your life or to sport or whatever. It's always thinking ahead and thinking forward as to what's going to happen next and how can I prepare for this next, I guess.
Yeah. So, fantastic achievement, climbing Everest. Did you decide to exit climbing after that, or were you looking at other projects?
So having, as I said, getting to the summit and getting back down again quite rapidly, it was only when we got back, not just to base camp, but we actually got back to sort of Kathmandu, where you suddenly could have your first shower for the last 2 months, and being back at sea level seemed to make a huge amount of difference as well. But also just the release of what must have been probably a huge amount of stress for the last 2 months without even realising it. And that release, you just felt amazing. Mm-hmm. And that amazing feeling lasted for probably another 2 months afterwards, where you kind of just felt that you kind of achieved what I wanted to achieve. And I came back to the UK fairly rapidly and enjoyed those next couple of months. And then you start to think about other climbing ideas. But ultimately, in the climbing world, you either do more technical things, which are going to be, more and more dangerous, basically. Yes. Couldn't get any higher. So it's sort of already, there was nothing else to sort of achieve on the pure ascent side of things. And it just happened that the friends that I'd been climbing with, for whatever reason, a couple moved abroad. 2 of them actually went back and climbed Everest the next year, but one of them got frostbite and he vowed he'd never climb again. So that sort of group broke up a bit. And I think my mind moved on to trying to sort of find other things to do. I didn't really want to do those very technical, very dangerous, very risky climbs, to be honest. That was never particularly the attraction. It was more the process of learning. So, I did, within about 6 months of coming back from Everest, didn't really do a great deal of climbing again. And once you sort of drop out of that world, you're either in it or you're not in it, yes. Really. Mm-hmm. It's something you sort of need to practice a lot. And so, I sort of started moving on to other things, and that was more back into marathon running again. I sort of got into thinking, well, how fast a marathon could I run? Or how fast a triathlon could I do? Getting back into doing Ironman competitions, particularly, because I'd run a lot, but I'd never cycled and swim a lot. So again, quite interested in getting faster on a bike, getting faster in the pool, and going through that learning process. There's obviously a lot to learn about triathlons. And then ultimately after that, getting into long distance, ultra distance trail running, 100-mile trail running, a whole different set of challenges, I suppose.
Yeah. So again, how did you get into the running then? Was it, I guess if you've been doing marathons, you'd be doing Ironman, that's like triathlon with marathon distance run, is that right?
Yeah.
So you've been running marathon distance as well as swimming and cycling in the same event, I guess, by this time. And And so, what was your first taste of ultra?
Well, my first true hardcore ultra was with Anna, doing the Hardmoors 60, I think it was, which actually was more like 65 miles along.
It was only 62 when I did it last year.
And
from Gisborough to Filey.
Yeah, well, I'm never quite sure exactly how far it was. It felt an awfully long way at the time. I mean, that was already, you see, I mean, that was a similar sort of desire. We both knew a lot about the UTMB, and were well aware of the UTMB. And again, it's come back to the process. I didn't suddenly decide I want to do Hardmoors 60 for any particular reason other than the fact that we kind of had heard about and seen the UTMB, and had walked it and thought, we'd like to actually go and compete in this event. But of course, there's a big lead up to the UTMB. You need to get the points and you need to go through the ballot. And so it's a sort of 2 to 3 year process you've got to go through to get there. So that was the first part of that, just entering Hardmoors event, and training for it as best we could, as well as we sort of knew how to, and turning up and seeing how we did. And it was tougher than it was probably one of the hardest sort of trail running races I've done, but only partly because we probably weren't fully prepared for it. And I think this is always going to be the case. I mean, if you're prepared, then things are so much easier. It's those events where you're just not well prepared become incredibly hard, especially towards the end. So if you're just not used to running or being, even on your feet for that amount of time, it is pretty tough. And so we were, in the second half of the field going around with some people who, and you're out there for so long if you're not that quick. That takes an awfully long time.
It does.
So that was quite a tough experience for us.
But you must have got some good learning out of that.
We certainly did. I mean, you start to realise the importance of conditioning your legs, even particularly on a coastal trail, where you've got a lot of real steep ups and downs. You've got to condition your quads properly for those descents.
Yes.
Otherwise, they're going to let you down in the second half of the race. The kit and not carrying too much and having the right sort of rucksacks and things like that. We learned a lot about that. Anna in particular, I think, had probably carried a bit too much. She gets very cold and was very worried about the possibility of getting very cold. So sort of adding in extra layers, but then you can easily and very quickly end up with a very heavy rucksack. And for me, carrying too much food, one of those people who'll go into an aid station with sort of an empty bag, and I'll fill it up with lots of food and carry it off with me thinking I'm going to eat this fairly soon, and carrying it all the way to the next aid station.
And then eating food in that aid station.
And carrying a huge chunk of food to the next aid station that I didn't really need. So trying to sort of get the weight down, because a heavy rucksack is definitely something is going to slow you down.
Yeah. So Hardmoors 60, and then I guess you have to do another few qualifying races to get your points for UTMB.
Yeah, we did. I can't quite remember which was the next one after that. But we then spent that next year. We certainly did one out in Samoa, which is a town in the Alps about an hour from Chamonix, which we go to a lot. Which was a real sort of wake-up call in terms of how hard it was. So we spent about 12 months, I guess, collecting enough points after the Hardmoors, that process, and then applying for the UTMB in the December of the following year, I think. And amazingly, we got in, that was 2014, got in through the ballot and got into the UTMB at the end of 2013. We raced in 2014, in July of that year in the UTMB. Which again was just another sort of step up in terms of the amount of ascent and descent, and the distance and the time that it took. And for me, the last 10 hours of that were a particularly intensely painful experience. And interestingly, it was one where Anna was early on feeling quite rough because of being unable to eat, feeling quite sick, struggling a bit, but then somehow in the middle of the race, turning that around, and she started to eat a bit more, felt better, and was really strong over the second half, whereas I was, in those last 10 hours, just sort of getting slower and feeling worse and worse and finding it harder and harder. It's one of those where you really start to realise that, you go through real phases of feeling bad or good or whatever, and you never quite know what's going to happen within the next few hours.
Yep.
As to where it's going to go. You can't get complacent if you're feeling good, because you may not be feeling so good in a few hours. Or equally, you shouldn't give up just because you're feeling awful, because actually everything can turn around.
Yes.
And suddenly you can be feeling so much better. And that's clearly something a lot of people have to sort of learn about ultras.
Yes.
Is that, you will go through these phases.
So have you run all of your ultras with Anna?
I have. So we started this path towards the UTMB, and Anna's a very quick runner, so I don't have to sort of slow down too much for her, if at all. On probably a very a short run, I might be a bit quicker, but once the distance increases, then the chances are we're going to be pretty similar speed. And it's just going to depend on who's feeling better on the day as to who sort of suffers more. But we always stick together, because again, for me, I do these things because of this whole learning process is interesting. Just being out in the mountains, I enjoy. I don't have ambitions to really win an ultra, although I was quite pleased in last year's TDS race. I actually ended up third in my age group at the TDS. So on the podium was quite fun. And if I can get to that sort of level in my age group, then I'm sort of quite happy. But the reality is I'm not these days going to actually win an ultra. So I'll be somewhere further down.
Never say never.
Well, it is possible. But,
I think if you ended up on the podium, even for the age group at TDS, then you're going well enough that it doesn't take much of an accident for the front of the field to all disappear, does it?
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah.
But we, Anna and I really enjoy doing these things together.
Yes.
So far we've never sort of on purposely split up. The only time we have actually split up was in the 2015 UTMB, where Anna was quite sick, and only made it about a quarter to a third of the way through the race, and there was no way she could carry on, and I did carry on to the finish. And then last year's TDS, unfortunately, she slipped over and sprained her ankle before halfway, and again had to pull out of those two races. Those are the only two that I've sort of carried on alone.
Yeah.
Without her.
Although you didn't make it to the start line on Lakeland 100, did you?
No, that's right. So in this past year, Anna has done one or two races without me, but that was the Lakeland 100 was because I was cycling last summer. I cycled around the whole Tour de France route over those 3 weeks. And so that focus on cycling meant I wasn't going to turn up and attempt the Lakeland 100 immediately afterwards. She did it alone.
Yeah, it's quite a phenomenal cycle, the Tour de France route.
The Tour de France, we did it exactly as the professionals would do it. The exact same set of stages. We simply did it 1 week in advance of the professionals, and it was a real insight into sort of their life and what they face every day, getting up and cycling that far every day. Obviously they're competing harder than we are. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely loved.
Well, are you trying to say your times weren't comparable?
No, we did compare our times on some of the big famous climbs. You can do that on Strava segments against some professionals, and clearly we were well behind. But I think everybody on that trip absolutely sort of loved the whole experience of going around the entire route. It was comparable to sort of a short ultra in that it was only sort of 8 hours of exercise every day, but getting up day after day and sort of getting back on your bike. I still don't think that it's as hard as getting up and running every day in a sort of these multi-day ultras, because you on a bike you just don't get the same amount of aching that you will running. I think multi-day ultras and the people who do the incredibly long trails, like the Appalachian Trail or whatever it is, going for 40, 50 days of non-stop running or anything like that is quite incredible.
Do you have any aspirations to do something like that?
It could be on the horizon to do something different, because again that would be something that I haven't done before, but I think that would be very painful, very hard. You often sort of think about what is actually the hardest thing you've ever done, and I do think that kind of thing could be a real challenge, one that you really don't know if you're going to get to the end of or not, and avoiding injury would be the biggest problem, I guess.
Yeah, I think finding that motivation to keep going when you get to that point of being broken, because I don't know if you've read Scott Jurek's book about doing it. North, I think it's called, is it?
I haven't read it yet. No.
So fairly early on he's quite broken.
Yeah.
And he has to, really look at his motivation for doing it. And I think that's really the key for something like that. 'Cause if he can't get through it without being completely broken, not many other people have got a chance. So I think it's like you were saying earlier about being prepared. If you're prepared to know what your motivation is, what it is you're trying to achieve, then when those difficulties come, you're prepared for them. What is it that's going to get you to get up the next day when everything's swollen and everything hurts, and go again? Because I think a few people have found that your body starts to heal itself on the trail,
right? If
you keep going.
That would be interesting. I mean,
that would be. You should definitely read his book about it. It's
right.
It's an interesting process that he goes through.
I mean, when we do big training sessions back to back, or 2 or 3 days in a row, I mean, it's the second and third day are almost sort of the hardest. What I don't know, and because I haven't experienced it, is then do you then start to almost feel better after that point of getting up every day and carrying on? Certainly on this sort of the Tour de France cycle, you did almost find it easier after a period of time. But I mean, I think cycling, multi-day cycling is just that much easier, and you don't have the same sort of stress going through your body. It's tiring, but you're just not getting the jarring and the sort of pain that you would when you're running. So I think that those very long distance running trails would be really, really hard, which kind of makes them quite interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, quite a challenge.
Yeah. A friend of mine just did he set a world record on, I think it's called Peter Pad in the Netherlands. Wouter Houtsing he's called. I think about 500 kilometers or something.
Right.
So it's not as long as the Appalachian Trail, but it's still pretty long.
Yeah. Something to look into.
Yeah. There's some interesting long trails around in Europe.
Well, it's the sleep deprivation as well. That's the big thing.
Yeah.
which is tough.
Well, there's an interesting race you could try in January.
No, I'm leaving that to you. You can tell us how that goes, and then maybe we'll think about it.
Yeah, I'll definitely.
It could be on the horizon. Yeah.
There'll be some learning going on with that for me.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a similar thing for myself, that, you know, the sort of the 100-mile distance. I wouldn't say I've, you know, got it nailed or something, but it is thinking about, well, what's the next part of the process that I want to learn about? Do I want to learn how to get significantly faster at the 100-mile distance, or do I want to learn about how to go longer? And so I'm kind of trying out going longer to see how I like it. See what I want to focus on for the next couple of years, probably.
Well, that's right. You've got to decide whether you actually enjoy it and like it, or whether you know, whether it's just a question of sort of going through the process. But yeah, it's an interesting challenge. Yeah,
it certainly is. So, quite a phenomenal sport and career that you've had, really. Yet, I'm guessing you're somebody that's just kind of flies under the radar and kind of never gets noticed by anybody. Yeah, you've done so many phenomenal things with the rowing. You know, we've been in world championships and climbing Everest, and even just completing UTMB and, you know, things like that. It's definitely a sport and career to be proud of.
Thank you.
I can see now why, because obviously Anna was asking me to come along and talk to you and share your story, and I know she's very proud of what you've done as well. And it's brilliant for the girls, I think, to have yourself and Anna to teach them about the process.
Yes.
And certainly from talking to Millie, I can see that she's really taken a lot on board.
Right. Well, we certainly never push them to do anything, but if they want to do something, I think we can help them a lot to get there, because I think whatever they want to do in that respect, we could probably come up with a plan to achieve it. We probably know how to get there.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I think that's the big benefit. It's not she's now a young girl that can run 100 miles. That's not the benefit. The benefit is learning the process.
Yes.
And learning the fact that there is a process that she can now have the confidence that she can follow and achieve whatever it is she sets out to do next.
Yes.
And I think that's absolutely massive.
Well, I'm a big believer in the idea that, you know, you can probably achieve almost anything, you know, sporting wise, or at least you can get to a very high level simply with, you know, it's not with natural ability, just, you know, it's just a sort of focus and a dedication and going through a process and accepting, you know, if I want to spend the next 2 to 3 years achieving this thing, I can probably do it.
Yes.
Because I certainly don't consider myself to be a sort of natural sports person with any particular natural abilities. It's a simple case of, you know, that's what I want to do, and then going off and doing it. Yeah, I mean, you know, if I don't have that natural ability, I might not be able to win Olympic gold, but I may be able to get into the national team and get close, but it may not be the absolute top, but you can get 95% or 98% of the way there. And, you know, that is still, you know, going through that process is what's sort of interesting, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And again, great example, I think, because as I start to progress in the sport and keep talking about it on podcasts and things, you know, people will ask me, you know, for advice, and I keep saying, well, you know, I'm not a coach. Advice, go and find somebody that knows what they're talking about. But I think it's really interesting what you've been saying about recognizing that there is a process there, and, you know, I think and please jump in if you think I'm saying this wrong. I don't think it's necessarily an exact process that you do step A, then step B, then step C, but it sounds like it's a process where you immerse yourself in the sport, learn about it, try, and then see where you're at and see what you need to learn next, and keep developing.
Well, that's right. I think there, a lot of sports, sports scientists agree on a few things. There's an awful lot they don't agree on, and you can debate and what have you. I think most people would agree, with endurance sports, ultimately, consistency and volume of training are pretty critical. So you've got to be able to train consistently and ideally not get injured over a season, and you've got to put in the miles. Those are critical. When it starts getting to sort of the marginal gains to get you to the very highest level, then there's sort of a lot of debate about, exactly which, how much interval training you should be doing, or tempo training, or whatever. And at that point, there are, you've got to, as you say, you immerse yourself in the sport and you make your own decisions about what you're going to do. And around nutrition, there's lots of different ideas.
Yep.
But I think there's a few common things. Everybody would agree you should be trying to eat as healthily as you can. I guess at some point, you may want to appoint or use a coach with some of these things, but a lot of it you can probably learn yourself, whether listening to podcasts or reading books, or just, for me, what I always find most interesting is actually to see real world people, the people at the top of the sport, and see exactly what they're doing. Because sports scientists, quite a lot of these things, they don't have a clear view. There's evidence, one way or another, or the scientific studies that have been done haven't been done on a big enough sample of people to know exactly what's going to happen. But if you can see a real world person who said, this is how I train and I got to this level, I find that really interesting. I find I can relate to that a lot more, perhaps than anything else.
Yeah, that's it's interesting, and I think very, very good advice for people that are looking to try and see how far they can go in the sport. One of the things I often say to people is, what I've tended to do since I came into the sport is look at the people that are maybe a few steps ahead of me. Not always look at the people that are right at the top, because I think from when I started, and I was lucky in that when I started I was maybe mid-pack, which is a good place to start rather than starting at the back. And if I looked at the people right at the front, there was probably 100 things that they were doing different, and then you can get overwhelmed about which thing to change. Whereas if you look at the people that are 10 places ahead of you or something, they might be doing 5 or 6 things that are different. You think, okay, I'll start with those. And that's the way I've kind of done it, as I've moved along. I've looked at the people that are a number of steps ahead of me, learned what those steps are, as a way of not having to try and learn everything from day one. And so far, so good. Making progress.
I think what's interesting is there is no single formula out there.
No,
and that's what
exactly.
almost makes it more interesting, because you can constantly have that discussion with people about nutrition, especially, or kit, or whatever. And there's new things coming out, but or different training regimes. And if there was a simple formula for everybody to follow, and we all followed the same thing, that would be quite boring in many ways. It's the fact that there is no clear-cut route. So you do have to sort of research things and try to work out what works for you as a person and what you can realistically incorporate into your life, given time constraints and the like. And it's a real sort of, a sort of jigsaw, as it were, a real puzzle to sort of put it all together. And that's what is interesting about it, I guess. Trying to be as good as you possibly can, given the amount of time and resources that we can actually put into it. And as you say, the people at the very top of sport are probably not a good example, because that is typically going to be their entire life, and you can usually it'll probably come down to the volume and time they're spending on it. But if you don't have that time, then you sort of have to work out how you're going to be as good as you can given the time you've got. But it allows for never-ending debates about the best kit, the best thing to eat.
Yeah, but I think one of the things I've started to learn now is actually that phrase, the best kit or the best thing to eat. Again, there isn't the best.
No.
There's the best maybe for you in this race, but what's best even for you in the next race can change.
Yeah.
Because things in your life have changed. You're different. You've got another race under your belt by the time you go to the next race. things change all the time.
They do change. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I think certainly the thing that we have in common is enjoying the puzzle and enjoying learning about it.
Yes, definitely. So, that's what keeps me interested.
Yeah, and me. Right, shall we end it there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for sharing your story, Richard.
No problem.
It's been,
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, been very interesting. And thank you for listening. Hopefully somebody's listened to this.
Hopefully.
I hope so. All right. Thank you very much.